When we think philosophically about truth, we want to know what truth is. We want to find this one thing and say, that's what truth is. But maybe truth isn't one thing. Maybe truth is many things. What does that even mean? Let's find out. Hello, welcome to Attic Philosophy. We are back in the attic. It's very much winter in here today. It's a double jumper Tuesday. In Attic Philosophy, we're going to be covering metaphysics, language, the mind, logic. Today we're focusing on pluralism about truth. So grab your coffee, get your thinking hat on, and let's talk some philosophy. Pluralism about truth is the idea that there isn't one theory of truth that will cover all cases. Rather, there are different kinds of truth out there, with different theories applying in the different cases. In a previous video, link here, I talked about the different theories of truth, and I talked you through the good and the bad points about each one. And the general thrust of the discussion was we had to try and find the one theory that worked best across all the ranges of cases. That might not be the best way of doing things. It might be that some of those theories work really well in some cases, but don't work well at all in other cases. So rather than picking the one theory, we should allow ourselves to say, well, in this case, truth is this, and in that case, truth is that, with a different theory in each case. Today, I'm going to be talking you through a book that I think makes a really good case for pluralism about truth, The Metaphysics of Truth by Doug Edwards. There's a link to the book down in the description. So I'm going to be talking you through some of the main features and arguments in the book. Doug starts off by thinking in terms of different ways of engaging the world in the way that we categorize things through the predicates we use. So a predicate is a piece of language like is happy said of a person, or is sitting, or is morally objectionable, or whatever. Doug talks about different kinds of predicates falling into different domains of speech. So for instance, there are the moral predicates like is morally praiseworthy, is morally objectionable. There are aesthetic predicates, is beautiful. There are mathematical predicates. There are scientific, physical predicates, like has a certain mass, has a certain charge. There are social predicates. There are institutional predicates, okay? There's all of these different domains of predicates. We use these predicates to do very different things. And we can group these predicates into the kind of categories that I was just talking about by looking at the way we as people use those terms. Okay, so nothing really controversial there. The interesting point comes in when we look at the properties in the world that these predicates correspond to. So the predicates are bits of language like is happy, whereas the property is the thing in the world, like the experience that I'm going through right now, my happiness. Doug then divides those properties into two broad classes. There is, on the one hand, the objective properties, and then there's what he calls the projected properties. Okay, so objective is fairly obvious. It's a property like I'm sitting. I mean, that's an objective fact right now. A projected property, by contrast, is something that we impose onto the world. So you might think that moral properties are like this. You might think that aesthetic properties are like this. So aesthetic beauty is not something that exists in the world. Rather, it's a category that we impose on the world based on the way things look or seem. Now, I'm not saying this is the right way to think about things, but it's certainly it's an interesting philosophical way of thinking about it, and it's the way Doug does things. Okay, so when we have this distinction between predicates, bits of language on the one hand, and properties, features in the world on the other, we can say, well, how do they match up? Now, we'd want to say in any case that I can apply a predicate to something, like I can apply the predicate is happy to me, just in case I really am that way, okay? So if I'm feeling happy, I can truthfully say of myself that I'm happy, so I can apply that piece of language to myself depending on what properties I have. So there's this matchup between truthful uses of language and the world. But then there's a question, which way does the explanation go? Okay, we've got this matchup between the two categories, language and the world. But is it that the language explains the world, or that the world explains the language? Does the direction of explanation go from property to predicate, or from predicate to property? Now we're starting to get into the pluralism. Whereas one philosopher might say it always goes one way and another philosopher might say it always goes the other, the point of a pluralist view is to say, well, in some cases, the direction of explanation goes one way, but in other cases, the direction goes in the other direction. In particular, according to Doug, when we have objective properties, the direction of explanation goes from the world, the way the world objectively is, to the language. So I can truthfully apply the predicate is sitting to me because I really am sitting. But in other cases, it's not going to work like that. So in a case where we have a projected property, let's take the example of aesthetic beauty. I might say that that painting is beautiful, but what we're doing there is we're projecting this property onto the world. So the reason the painting has that property is because we use language in a certain way. So the direction of explanation goes from us using language in a certain way, us truthfully applying that predicate, to the thing in the world really having that property. It has that property because we apply the predicate in a certain way. Okay, so we're going to have to be careful here. We're going to need a bit of clarification about what we mean by we using language in a certain way. This pluralist view is not an anything goes kind of view where in certain domains like aesthetics, you can use language however you want. This kind of Humpty Dumpty use of language. We're not saying that. So we're not saying that just because I think the painting is beautiful, because I apply the predicate, then it really is, and you say it's not beautiful, so it both is and isn't beautiful. That's not the view. We're talking about the way we, as a whole community of language users, apply predicates. Okay, so as a community of language users, we fix on a meaning, a kind of roughly agreed standard for what counts as beautiful via the way that we use words like beautiful. Here's another example that might help make this case clearer. Take the case of whether a joke is funny or not. If you tell me a funny joke, I don't get to decide whether it's funny. It's not up to me. But it's not really up to the world either. It's not really an objective fact. It's more like we as a whole community of language users get to decide what we find funny. So there's kind of rough and ready community standards of what counts as being funny. So whether or not your joke counts as funny is something that we all together get to decide. So this notion, it falls somewhere between the objective, like I'm sitting, and the subjective, like, that seems good to me. It's intersubjective. So there is a fact of the matter about whether your joke's funny, but it's a fact that's determined by the ways in which we as language users interact. This focus on topics like humour, it comes from Crispin Wright's 1992 book, Truth and Objectivity. I'll put a link down in the description. And this book, it was one of the first to introduce this kind of pluralism about truth. Okay, so now let's link this back to truth. So the idea is we have two kinds of uses of sentences in language. We have a representational use and we have a non-representational use. The representational use is going to go along with those predicates that we take to pick out objective properties. The non-representational use is going to go with those predicates that we take to pick out projected properties. So when we're talking about objective scientific matters, we are using representational language. When we are talking about aesthetics, maybe about ethics, maybe about mathematics, about humour and stuff like that, we are using non-representational uses of language. In both cases, we want to say that a sentence is true just in case the world is that way, okay? So it's true to say that A is F just in case the object A has the property F. But again, we have this difference in which way the direction goes. Does it go from A is F to, well, then it's true that A is F? Or does it go from the truth to A having that property? Okay, so in the case of I'm sitting, it seems the direction of explanation goes from the world, I'm sitting, I have the property of sitting, to, well, then it's true to say that I'm sitting. But in the case of your joke was funny, it looks like the explanation might go the other way around. We as a community set standards for what counts as being funny, so we decide that that kind of thing is funny, and then that's what makes it the case that your joke was funny. So the use of language, the fact that it's true to say that your joke was funny, determines that your joke had that property. So the direction of explanation there goes from the truth to the world. So in each case, we have this matchup between truth and the world, but we have differences in the direction of explanation. World to truth versus truth to world. So when we have this distinction between representational versus non-representational uses of language, we can line that up with different theories of what truth is. In the case of representational language, we might say that truth is correspondence. So for a representational sentence to be true, just is for it to correspond to an objective fact in the world. But in the case of non-representational uses of language, we don't have this objective fact in the world, we just have the projected properties. So according to the pluralist, we're going to need a different theory of truth there. This theory of truth for the projected properties might be one of the theories that we talked about in the previous video, link here. So we might say that for moral, ethical, aesthetic language, the right theory of truth is the coherence theory or the pragmatic theory or something like that. As it happens, contemporary pluralists about truth tend to draw on a notion called super-assertability to account for truth in the projected properties domain. So let me tell you a little bit about what this means. It's gonna get a little bit technical, so just stick with me for a little bit. Super-assertability is a notion introduced by Crispin Wright in his 1992 book, Truth and Objectivity. And the idea is this. Suppose that I have a justification or a warrant for believing something, and suppose that no matter how much I investigate that topic, that justification isn't going to go away. So it's not that my justification stays just because I'm being pig-headed and I'm not looking into the facts. I'm really trying hard to get to the truth. And as much and as hard as I look, that justification never goes away. If that happens, then my belief is super assertable. So let's suppose that I go to the gallery and I see this painting and I think, that looks pretty beautiful to me. So I believe it's beautiful and then I investigate. So I ask all the art historians, I ask the experts, I go and talk to some academic philosophers about what beauty is, I go and talk to the general public and see what they think. And suppose that in doing this, nothing shakes my belief that the painting's beautiful, then my saying that painting is beautiful is super assertable. So this is an epistemic notion of truth, because whether or not the belief counts as super assertable really stays in the epistemic realm. It doesn't make direct contact with the objective facts. But that's okay, because if we want to make direct contact with the facts, we have a correspondence theory of truth. We want a different notion of truth for the projected properties domain, if we're going to be a pluralist. So what many pluralists say is, in the objective domain, when we use language to make direct contact with the world, we think about truth in the correspondence way. And then it's the facts that determine the truths. In the projected properties domain, a sentence or a belief is true if it's super assertable. So there, we don't have to rely on there being objective facts in the world. Rather, we explain the truth of things, both in terms of the way we use language and then in terms of my beliefs being super assertable or not. So we have these two properties, each equally worthy of the name truth, each functioning just like the way we want truth to function, but working in their own domains. Each works well there, but if we try to apply one in the other domain, it won't work nicely at all. So that's pluralism about truth. It's a metaphysical view because it says there are different properties out there that count as being a property of truth. Different pluralists will give slightly different theories. They'll all be along these lines, but there's going to be slight nuances of difference. So I'm going to talk about a few of those differences and why you might go one way or the other way. So first up, I've been talking about properties of truth, different properties. Not all pluralists will agree with this language. Some talk just in terms of the language. There is a truth predicate, the word is true, and we should stop there. Others talk about our concept of truth. We have different concepts of truth for different domains of language use, but there's really no property there. Personally, I'm happy to talk about properties because a property is just a thing that different things have in common, okay? And different sentences, they might have being true in common. So we should talk about a property of truth. Maybe a bigger issue for the pluralist is, should we say that in addition to the specific truth properties, like correspondence truth, superassertability truth, maybe coherence truth, in addition to these, is there a further generic notion of truth that applies to all and only the truths? So if I take a sentence that is true in the correspondence way, like I'm sitting right now, and then another sentence that's true in the projected properties way, like that joke you told me was funny, is there something that those sentences have in common? Is there a way in which they're both true? One's correspondence true, one's superassertable true, but is there a further way in which they have truth in common? Now that's really a kind of technical metaphysical issue, but it does have important consequences because of the kind of things we want to do with truth. Here's one of them. We want to say that an argument counts as valid when there's this guarantee that if the premises are true, then the conclusion's true. Validity is about preserving some property, truth, from the premises to the conclusions. But there's a worry there for the pluralist because they don't have just one property of truth, they have a whole bunch of them. Consider the following kind of argument. Premise 1, torture causes pain. Premise 2, anything that causes pain is morally wrong. Conclusion, torture is morally wrong. That looks like a valid argument. But what property is being preserved from premises to conclusions? Premise 1, torture causes pain, well that's more or less an objective fact. Okay, it's talking about pain, so that's a subjective feature, but we can pretty much tell that torture causes pain. I think there's an objective fact there. So that should be a correspondence truth. Premise 2, whatever causes pain is wrong, well that's a moral truth. So it would be accounted for by the pluralist by superassertability. These premises are both true, but they're true in different ways. And then the conclusion, torture is wrong, well, that's another superassertable truth. It's a moral truth. So it looks like there is no kind of truth that is being preserved from the premises to the conclusion. The pluralist looks like they're unable to say why that argument is valid. The problem is it looks valid, it's logically valid, pluralists can't explain this. Or maybe they can. If they have this generic notion of truth, a kind of truth that all and only the true sentences have, regardless of how they're true, generic truth, then we can say both premises, although they're true in different ways, they're both generically true, and so's the conclusion. So it's generic truth that is preserved from premises to conclusions in a valid argument. So that's a reason for truth pluralists to accept a generic notion of truth. But then there's a worry going in the other direction. If pluralists accept a generic notion of truth, a generic property of truth, to what extent does that undermine their pluralism? They've now got this notion of truth, generic truth, that seems to do all we want in a theory of truth. So why not just say, that's what truth is? Then we would be monists rather than pluralists about truth. There are other issues surrounding this notion of generic truth, like what's the relationship between a particular kind of truth, like correspondence, and generic truth? We want to say that if something is correspondence true, then it's generically true. But not vice versa. Something can be generically true without being correspondence true, because it might be superassertable true. So maybe it's like the relationship between being scarlet and being red. If anything is scarlet, then it's red, but things can be red without being scarlet. This is called the determinable determinate relationship. Red is a determinable property and one of its determinants is scarlet. So this is kind of the explanation that Doug Edwards goes for in his book, What Truth Is. He gives a very nice analogy between truth and winning. So think about all the different kind of games we could play and all the different ways you've got of winning in those games. There really isn't something common to all of those ways of winning. This is kind of a point that Wittgenstein makes in the Philosophical Investigations. There's really no definition you can give that unifies all the different games because they're so varied. Nevertheless, we know what winning is, and if you win a game of chess and I win a game of solitaire, then we're both winners in some sense. So the analogy is between all of the different ways of winning, that's like all the different truth properties, and then there is this generic overall notion of being a winner, which is like the notion of generic truth. And that's when the camera stopped working. Why? So here I am, talking to you from the future. I'm just going to wrap this video up now. Pluralism about truth, I think it's a great theory. There's so much going for it. If you're interested in this, Doug's book is a great place to start. Personally, I'm not a pluralist about truth, but my reasons for rejecting the theory, they're kind of complicated and technical, and this video, it's gone on for long enough already. If you're interested in my reasons, I've published a long book review of Doug's book. I've put a link down in the description. Personally, I'm a truth-maker theorist. I think that for a proposition to be true, there has to be a state of affairs in the world that makes it true. And I think there can be lots of different kinds of states of affairs. There can be objective states of affairs, there can be intersubjective states of affairs, there can be all different kinds of states of affairs, so I'm a pluralist about truth makers rather than a pluralist about truth. There is one property of truth, having a truth maker, but there are lots of different ways in which a truth can have a truth maker. So that's my view. I'm going to do a whole video explaining and arguing for it, but that's for another occasion. Okay, so that's all for today. If you enjoyed the video, please hit like. It would mean a lot to me if you subscribe to the channel. And look, things are difficult out there in the world right now. Okay, so let's all be kind to each other, be caring, be compassionate, maybe take some time away from social media, call your elderly relatives. Okay, that's it for today. Stay safe. I'll see you next time.